All right, we're going to get ourselves started. Um, Thanks everybody for coming on tonight. And we have a wonderful speaker with us, Kelly Buchanan, and she is a clinical psychology doctoral candidate at Binghamton University, and she is currently completing her pre-doctoral internship at Johns Hopkins in Maryland. So, Kelly, go ahead and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Okay, I have slides. I'm going to share them, but before I do, I was hoping that anyone who's comfortable or willing could use the chat to maybe tell me who you are. So if you're a parent, an educator, um, and what you're hoping to learn about social skills and teaching social skills today. Um, no need to go into a lot of detail. I just would love to know a little bit about who I'm talking to and um, tailor what I'm talking to you if it's possible. I'll give you a minute. Yeah, social isolation, definitely. Social interactions get so much more complicated with puberty. Reading the room. Mm. Thanks, those of you who are sharing. I really appreciate it. Keeping friends once you make them. Reading the room. All right, I'll have to make sure we have some discussion at the end about what specifically reading the room might mean to you and to your kids. Um, that's my goal is to talk fast enough that I leave some room for discussion at the end. So saying that out loud for accountability. Feel free to stop me at some point. All right, thank you all for sharing. All right, so hopefully we can touch on some of these things. Needs coaching. Yep. Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, I'm so excited to be here with you all. Let's get these slides shared. So you introduced yourself. I will just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm not going to tell you um, too much because that's not why we're here, but I love a visual. So this is my visual of kind of where my professional and education journey has taken me so far. I'm from North Carolina. At UNC, where I did my undergrad, is where I got interested in psychology and specifically did a lot of work with their Teach Autism program. Really loved working with autistic kids, kids with disabilities more broadly. And I also worked at a summer camp there for both kids and adults, mostly autistic. Um, and so when I graduated from college, I said, what's a job that's most like camp? I want to be at camp the rest of my life. And so I worked for a few years at a school for kids with disabilities. That made me want to go back to grad school to learn a little more about how I could kind of play a role in making services and interventions better for the kids we were working with. So that took me to upstate New York, and where I've been for the last 6 years, and now I'm at Kennedy Krieger and Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, hopefully in the last year of my PhD. So across all those places, I've worked in a lot of different clinical settings, primarily with autistic youth, but also youth with other presenting developmental and mental health issues, and pretty much I say across the lifespan. I probably with older adults don't have much experience, but from young to middle adulthood down to like very young kiddos. So hopefully I've um, given you an idea of where I'm speaking from, and that helps you contextualize the information that I hope to share. A couple disclaimers. I I did say my background is primarily in autism, so I'm no expert on ACC or DCC. You guys are the experts there. I do know that there's a lot of overlap in some of the social communication challenges that come up. So I'm hoping the strategies that I share, which are largely informed my work with autistic youth, are applicable. I'm also going to talk about one specific evidence-based program called Peers, and because I think that some of the materials they have, A, are accessible, and B, are representative of the broader strategies I want to talk about. But I am not an official representative of the organization or the curriculum, so I want that to be clear. I'm not here to say that this is the one way to do anything. I have gone through their official training, so I have experience with it, and I have provided groups to both teens and adults, but I'm not officially representing them in any way. So my goals today are A, just to talk a little bit at first about what social skills are, because I think we use the term a lot in terms of what our kids or students need help with. But sometimes we're talking about a lot of different things that it's helpful to define more precisely. And I want to identify what some of those common social challenges are related to developmental disabilities. Um, I'm going to plug a little bit of a neuroaffirming lens when talking about social skills, because when we talk about social skills intervention and when we approach teaching our kids social skills, um, historically there have been some um, concerns with how that's done and how we present, right or wrong social interactions. So I'd love to talk about what that means to me. I want to introduce some evidence-based strategies for teaching social skills, and that's where I hope to bring in some of the peers materials to show you what that can look like in practice. And then, like I said, I hope to leave some room for discussion. So I'd really like to talk about how we can apply those strategies to some of the things that you maybe brought up in the chat or things that you might think of throughout that apply to your kids. So if you don't mind continuing to participate in the chat, I'm curious what you think when you think social skills. What are social skills? Talking to peers, interacting with others, communicate with others. hmm Yeah, verbalization is often a big part of social interaction, allowing to connect. Yeah, unpredictability. You don't know how people are going to react. Body language, tone of voice, peers and adults, community, very good. Okay, beautiful. We've got some great examples. So, most broadly, social skills are any learned abilities that enable a person to interact competently and appropriately in a given social context. So, a context involving one or more other people. So, any skills that help us navigate that's a social skill. So you guys named a lot of great ones. Flexibility and play, that's a really good one. Um, Here's some that I thought about before this meeting. So got a lot of overlap with some of the ones you named. Greetings, responding to other people's nonverbal cues, pretend play, sharing, humor, understanding and responding to facial expressions. Um, so this obviously is not a conclusive list, but I wanted to kind of put us in this context of social skills that we often talk about maybe with younger children, or when we're talking about the basics or things like saying hello, taking turns, but that social skills get really complicated and build on each other, and kind of pop up in every aspect of many of our days. Starting and ending conversation, yeah, is a big one. Yeah, how do you know when to end a conversation? These things are so complicated. Um, and social skills are highly context dependent. So, um, I'm going to ask again you to think about in different contexts, what social skills would you use at a birthday party? Singing, that's a really good one. Yeah, when to sing the happy birthday song, when to not sing it, sharing enjoyment, manners, turn taking, please and thank you, wishing happy birthday. Yeah, so like context specific greetings, sharing attention, really good. All right, how about at school? What social skills are important at school? Small talk's such a hard one. Waiting your turn, conversation, not making fun of people, waiting turns. Yeah, what is appropriate to discuss at different times of the day? Volume, focus. Excellent. All right, how about this is kind of like the adult equivalent, knowing how to use the bathroom quickly. Very good. So navigating routines in the appropriate way. Asking for help is such a big one. Using different forms of communication. All right, so yeah, as an adult, how does that generalize to any kind of workplace? I know that workplaces can look a lot different. Um, yep, understand expectations, time management, organization, mm, navigating, talking to peers when gender and potentially romantic expectations come into play, tone of voice. All right, how about at the pharmacy? What social skills might you need at the pharmacy? Mhm. Advocating for what you need, giving information, how to ask for what you need, greetings, waiting, asking questions, using clear details. Yeah, I mean, something as, you know, to some people it might not even occur to them, but like, how far do you stand from the person in front of you in line? What's an appropriate distance? Do you stand too close? Do you stand too far? What if you're not in line? Things like that. So my point is just social skills is a really broad concept. So one of the things we're going to talk about is how to even define like what are the social skills that are relevant for a kid to be one. Um, I told you that I also wanted to bring in a lens of being neurodiversity affirming. So I'm assuming many of you are familiar with a pro neurodiversity lens, but just in case this is not something that you're familiar with, the idea of neurodiversity is that variety in people's brains and their neurotypes is a normal and beneficial aspect of human diversity and should be celebrated, not viewed as wrong or broken. So we talk about this a lot in the autism field, but as opposed to the medical model where we're often defining differences as wrong or problematic, stepping back and realizing that like we all think and interact in different ways, and a lot of that variation is beautiful and great and brings in a lot of strengths. And so when we talk about things that are challenging or things that are hard with disabilities, that a lot of it is defined by context and by the skills that other people bring into the room. And being careful to present, for example, social skills not as something that is either wrong and broken or right and intact about a person, but things that vary based on the person's strengths and the goals that they're trying to meet in the context they're in. So, this is historically with social skills intervention and with training something that a lot of disabled adults have spoken up about needing to be cognizant of the fact that there's not a clear right and wrong when we're talking about social skills and social interaction, and that framing social skills as right and wrong can be harmful to kids, people in general. Adults are not immune, feeling othered or feeling like they're broken, and that we can empower kids to build social skills that are going to serve them without framing them as they're doing something wrong all the time. So I'm going to really try to highlight how when we support kids in learning social skills, we should do so in a way that's informed by their goals, their family's goals, and incorporating their strengths as well. So that said, here are some of the common social challenges that many people with developmental disabilities do experience in the larger social context. So from a neurotypical path, one might feel like social interactions or social situations go smoothly, that understanding cues and expectations comes more naturally, and guide what a person is supposed to do. Um, they might be able to pick up more easily on nonverbal cues like body language, facial expressions, tone of voice. Um, that there's a natural reciprocity in social interaction. So it feels like kind of a comfortable two-way give and take. Feels like it comes naturally, and that there's understanding of a lot of unwritten social rules. So in in typical development or in mainstream society, a lot of people might feel like I never really have to think about all these cues that I'm using or rules that I'm following. They just kind of I get them from watching. Um, I don't know if any of you are like TikTok or Threads users, but I thought there was a great example that came up recently, and maybe this is niche, but if you're a fan of Elise Myers, she's a TikTok influencer and she just wrote a book and released this book. Um, and somebody on Threads, which is like the new version of Twitter, posted a review of this book. They said that it was disappointing to them, not what they expected. They didn't tag Elise Myers in this comment. But she responded to it, and for most people's reporting, it seems like a pretty kind comment. She said, I'm sorry that you were disappointed. Feel free to return it. Not every book's going to be for everyone. It wasn't really an aggressive comment, but Book Talk and Threads got really angry at her for responding to this comment that was a review of her book. And so, through this whole thing kind of going viral, I learned, and I think a lot of people learned, that there's an unwritten rule in posting book reviews on social media that the author is not to respond to them unless they are tagged directly. That apparently it's a very unacceptable to the author of a book to respond to reviews about their book. Um, and Elise Myers spoke about it after and was like, I literally didn't know this. She's actually diagnosed as autistic. And I just thought it was a great example of an unwritten rule that everyone in this little book talk culture knew about, but there's not a guide somewhere that a new author reads before they get on Threads and says like, "Oh, I'm not supposed to do this." So if you don't just pick up on the fact that that's the culture, that's the expectation, I mean, it got a lot of people really mad at her, and it's not a rule that's written anywhere. So I feel like that's a great representation about how social interactions can feel sometimes for people with social communication challenges. So for them, it can often feel like social interactions are really bumpy. There's roadblocks that you don't see coming. You don't understand the road signs. You don't know how to follow the cues or the written expectations. You might not notice or know what to make of some of the nonverbal cues. You might not really understand the balance of reciprocity that's expected. And there's all these unwritten rules that a lot of neurodivergent people feel like, how was I supposed to know that? Um, and so some of those common challenges include um, really literal interpretation of language. So that makes things like tone, sarcasm, idioms, humor really difficult to follow, missing nonverbal cues, difficulty with recognizing and interpreting others' emotions and perspectives, and a lot of difficulty with those unwritten rules. Like if something is an expectation, tell me that it is. Um, so these are common across developmental disabilities, things that might be hard in social situations. Um, and like I said, there's not a clear right or wrong way to interact. So, for example, one social skill that frequently is, has been historically targeted in social skills intervention is eye contact. Eye contact can be a really integral part of a conversation. It's how you might interpret that someone is interested in you, that they're listening to you, that you're paying attention. Um, But if you make too much eye contact, if you're not like occasionally looking away, or if your eye contact is too intense, then someone might feel uncomfortable. We know that autistic people are less comfortable with eye contact. Some of them say that they find it harder to focus on what the person is saying if they're focusing on eye contact. So for them, or for people who feel like that if they're making eye contact, it might indicate they're paying less attention. And that can apply to a lot of different things. So, like, when is it appropriate to make small talk versus when it is not appropriate to make small talk? Or what is the appropriate content for small talk? When is it okay or expected to express physical affection versus when it's not okay? Giving compliments. Sometimes giving compliments is a great way to make connections and make people feel good. Sometimes giving compliments makes people feel uncomfortable. It makes them feel like you're coming on too strong or that you're being inappropriate. Lying is one that, we often teach kids there's hard and fast rules about, lying is wrong. And if you're a very literal interpreter of rules and language, you might think that means that you always have to share the whole truth, the full truth with whoever asks. You might miss some learned safety behaviors like not sharing a bunch of information with a stranger or not answering someone super honestly when they ask if you like their shirt and you don't. So lying's a complicated one. Talking to strangers sometimes is okay and expected, sometimes absolutely not. So it gets really complicated. And I just want to emphasize this, what is socially skillful is so context dependent. So, um, we talk about in the autism field about the double empathy problem that we talk about social challenges often from the lens of like in a neurotypical majority, the neurodivergent person is the wrong or different. But what we actually see in research is that two neurodivergent people who might share some of those same social differences, when they're interacting, there's actually increased social understanding, increased social satisfaction, just like we see with a so said neurotypical person and another neurotypical person interacting, that same level of social understanding. And what the real problem is when we have two people from different social preferences or different social neurotypes interacting. So it's really more of a problem with miscommunication across different social approaches or different neurotypes rather than one is functional and one is not. Um, So here's a quote from the founder of Peers, which I'm going to talk to you about, that learning social skills is not about changing a person. It's about enhancing our interactions so others can appreciate us for who we already are. And I think that's important context for anyone working on social skills to go back to frequently. All right, so there are four main strategies that I'm going to focus on today, that when you are thinking about social challenges for your child, your young people that you're working with, that are evidence-based that we know are helpful for people who have social communication challenges to adapt to expected skills in a given situation. And I'm going to go through them one by one and tell you a little more about what I mean by them. All right. So for direct and explicit instruction, this is terminology, if any of you are in the education world, is applied to all sorts of things, not just social skills, but is basically the idea that don't assume that someone is going to pick up on how social interactions go just by watching and learning kind of in that more natural way that some people pick up social skills. So thinking about making the unwritten rules explicit. What are the rules? Let's name them. Let's label them. Let's be very specific about when they apply and when they don't. And let's spend time teaching our kids why those rules exist and what they are like. Some considerations when you're deciding how to go about this. You want to think about, again, the context. So, what is the target environment that your young person is struggling in? What are their goals in that environment? How can you help them navigate how to prepare for that situation, what cues to look for during that situation, different responses they could choose, and how to execute those. Um, and be very specific. So one of you in the chat mentioned, starting and ending an interaction. What do you have to decide before it even starts? How do you know when it starts? How do you know when it ends? How do you do that step? So getting very concrete and very specific. That goes hand in hand with the second strategy I'm going to focus on, which is breaking things down into steps. So social interactions are really complex. The more you can break it down into small, digestible steps, put them in a sequence, make it very methodical. Um, Help a kid practice the steps in order and practice them from start to finish. Talk about what might happen at every step of the process. Like, what happens if someone reacts this way? Then what do we do next? What if this happens? What are your options? And put those things into lists or scripts. I want to show you what some of those might look like. Repetition and practice is so important. And this is, important for any new skill, but socially, this is something that often, once we have done some of these first steps, we've talked to our kid about here's what the expectations are, here's how to go about this social situation. We kind of expect that they can go out and apply it. But sometimes kids, especially those with executive function challenges, have difficulty with future planning. So they really have trouble taking that like conceptual knowledge and applying it to the situation or an action in vivo. So repetition and practice of the skills that you're wanting to work on can really help bridge that gap between like talking about what the expectations are and implementing them successfully. So in your role as the adult in the situation, the parent or the teacher, creating those opportunities to practice, scaffolding them so that kids are working, starting with more prompting or more structure and gradually working away from that. Giving a lot of labeled praise. So when a kid is doing something well, making sure that you notice and label what they're doing well. Um, One thing that's I like to point out as part of this repetition and practice is when kids are practicing, a social skill or situation, um, letting them try to get through an interaction and then debriefing after rather than prompting them at every step. So that's something someone mentioned in the chat was like, I'm standing over them all the time. I feel like I'm prompting every step. So seeing if you can fade that out, and problem solve after, but let them get through an interaction. Asking a lot of perspective taking questions. So I mentioned that one common social challenge is being able to both cognitively and then behaviorally understand and respond to what other people are experiencing. So after social interactions or after practicing, pointing out, all right, well, what might someone else have noticed about how you are acting? How might that make them feel? Practicing that, considering someone else's experience. And then a lot of encouragement to try new skills because a big thing that can come along with social challenges is low confidence, low self-esteem. So, providing reinforcement, providing encouragement, setting up opportunities where kids are likely to feel the positive outcomes of, trying out these skills is really important. And then I want to talk about generalization because if we just talk about these skills and we just practice them in very controlled environments, they might not, we might not see them helping our kids when they go out into the very complex social worlds that they exist in, like at school or in the community. So being really intentional about planning and finding opportunities to practice and continue building on those skills, asking yourself what skills and contexts are most important to your child and your goals, and finding ways that are meaningful, environments that are meaningful in which to practice those. And how do you connect those with your young person's strengths and give them the tools to advocate for themselves effectively? All right, so I told you I was going to tell you a little bit about a specific program called Peers, and this is a program developed at UCLA that it's well established. It's existed for a couple of decades now. It stands for the Program for the Education and Enrichment of Relational Skills. There is peers programming for all ages, from preschoolers to adults. Um, it has been largely researched with autistic folks, but is not specific to autism. It's been used with people with other developmental disabilities, other mental health challenges, so maybe social anxiety, ADHD that interfere with the development of social skills. A big component of peers is that it involves the parent or the caregiver in helping support their child and being sort of a social coach, which is one thing I really like. Um, and the reason I'm talking specifically about peers is A, because that's where a lot of my social skills training comes from. But another thing that I really like about peers is that there's a ton of research on it, and they have these manuals that this one right here I'm showing is one geared for someone maybe leading a group, but they also have a book geared towards parents, and they have really nicely broken down a lot of common social skills that are really helpful in very concrete ways. So this direct teaching, um, breaking down into simple sequential steps, they've done that really nicely. It's really easy for a parent or a caregiver to pick up one of those books and not have to start from scratch to be able to talk to their kid or their student about how to break down some more complex social skills. So in that way, it's a really nice tool to have, and it's pretty accessible to a wide range of people that might find it useful. Um, they emphasize a focus on ecologically valid skills. So what that means is not focusing on right or wrong, but focusing on what are some common ways that people who tend to be socially satisfied and socially successful navigate interactions. So people that report having a lot of connections, feeling happy in their friendships, what are the kinds of things that they do? And that's how they define what is going to be a useful social skill. And they integrate in this model a lot of um, modeling, a lot of practicing, and helping with like homework assignments and gradually increasing the complexity of those to support the generalization of those skills. And the program is really designed to help the people, kids or adults, start developing meaningful connections and applying those skills in their real lives in ways that are meaningful to them. Um, I'm not going to go into too much about the structure of peers. What I do want to say is that peers is meant to be a group intervention. And I know that I'm talking to people from across the country. If you're lucky, there might be a peers provider or a peers group or even several peers groups in your location. And that might be a great resource for your kid if they're struggling with social connection and social skills. But I want to qualify that by saying in a lot of places, there's not a peers provider, an ongoing peers group. For my example, I ran a couple peers groups up in Binghamton, New York when I was there, and they were great. And the need or the interest of the community members was clearly there. But now that I've left Binghamton and I'm in Maryland, there's no one running those groups right now. And so we still have people knowing that we ran these previously asking, where they can find a group. And right now it's just the demand is much higher than the supply for these kinds of groups. So I don't want to focus on a official clinical group setting as the only way that you can use these strategies to support your kid. So I want to emphasize that these books are out there. If you can find a peers group, awesome. But I want to emphasize the strategies that they're using that make it an effective program. So here's some of the skills that peers focuses on. I think several of your contributions in the chat echoed some of these. It's nice to have the topics laid out for you. So things like trading information, maintaining conversations, they do include ending and starting conversations in there. Finding appropriate sources of friends. So, okay, you're lonely, you want to make friends. Where do you find friends? Electronic communication is a big one this day and age. Humor, group conversations, get-togethers, sportsmanship. For the older age groups, they have dating, problem solving, handling conflict, and bullying. So, some really useful social topics. I'm going to pull in just some peers examples for two different skills. So, I'm going to focus on trading information and entering group conversations. And the reason I chose those two skills is trading information, this building block of so many different social interactions. So I figured that one might be of more universal interest. And then the entering group conversations, I chose to pull in some examples from that because I think that's a skill that maybe it's harder for the layperson who hasn't thought about this before to think about really what's a useful way to break that down. So I'll show you how Pierce does it. All right, so in my four steps, the direct instruction, the breaking down into simple steps, um, practice and repetition, and then generalization, here's what that looks like in peers for trading information. So if you use peers resources or if you were talking about this with your kids, some things that you might talk about for why trading information is a useful and relevant skill is exploring like what is friendship? Why does one want to make friends? And then when you defined like what makes a good friend, highlighting that friendship is often based on common interests. And how do you find out what common interests you might have with a potential friend? You trade information with them. So trading information is how peers conceptualizes this idea of exchanging information and ideas with the common goal of finding interests that you might share with a potential friend. It also covers things like how friendship is a choice, it's bi-directional. So here are skills that can help you make friends, but no one is required to be your friend, and you're not required to be anyone else's friend. So it teaches things like it's okay if you don't identify common interests in a conversation with someone, and maybe that's just not someone you're going to spend more time with, and that's okay too. Um, Peers has some publicly available videos that show what they call socially helpful and socially risky examples of each of the different skills. I'm not going to play them because I think our time is better spent talking to each other, but I can link them in the resources that I share. Um, and they're part of that explicit instruction, showing like what it might look like when an interaction of trading information goes well. What are some things that might come up that are not as helpful in a social interaction? And these are great in any sort of teaching environment to talk about, like, well, what's going on here? How might this person feel? So some of those perspective taking questions, identifying skills. Another thing these videos provide is, I don't know if you've ever tried to point out to your child or to a student where they might be making some risky social decisions and trying to do that while balancing, like being supportive and bolstering their self-esteem. Sometimes it can be a lot harder to identify social challenges in yourself. But by doing it in a video, kids are often a little more able to engage in saying like, "Oh, look at what she's doing. That's not helpful. Like, I would be so annoyed," and kind of distancing it from kind of that self-esteem piece where a child might feel put on the spot or discouraged by identifying that in themselves. Oh, nope, I don't want to play it. Okay, here's an example for trading information of how this skill, exchanging information, is broken down into clear steps. I'm not going to read them all to you, but I just want you to get an idea of what that can look like. So, asking a person about herself, after they finish answering, answer your own question. So, that's a skill. We spend a lot of time just practicing that skill of, you ask someone what their hobby is or what they're doing this weekend, and they give you an answer. If you don't know what to do next, that conversation might end. But if you say, well, I'm going to the movies this weekend, it keeps that conversation going, finding common interests, sharing the conversation, noticing some of these nonverbal cues to assess their interest, knowing how personal to get. So these are all things that we break down and talk about individually. What does repetition and practice look like? For this particular skill, we often have kids practice with each other or with someone comfortable. So practice trading information with your parent. And you might say, like, I talk to my kid every day. I know everything about them. And they might say the same thing about you if you present that practice opportunity to them. But we find that kids and parents, when they practice this, they learn new things about each other and they identify common interests they might not have appreciated before. So you get to practice the skill and the steps with someone with low social pressure, and then you can build on that. So practicing with other family members, maybe a sibling. You can debrief after, ask perspective taking questions, revisit some of the skills we talked about in the lesson and how they might have come up in that practice session, and gradually start to build to practicing with peers in other settings. Getting distracted by the chat, but thanks, Catherine. Um, Example of generalization for trading information. So it's kind of a continuation of the how do you gradually increase the level of independence. So whereas these things might be more structured in the beginning, so you say, hey, you're going to call your grandmother and I want you to focus on trading information for 5 minutes. That might be like a very distinct practice opportunity. And once they're feeling comfortable with that, then you can move it to, hey, like we're standing in line with someone at the grocery store, which that's a really complex social interaction, but how might trading information apply to there? Or maybe like your neighbor when you see them on a dog walk. So pointing out and making connections to like, oh, that was awesome trading information, or really great answering your own question, helping connect the skills and the language that you've done in a very controlled setting to other daily interactions can help reinforce those skills. All right. So then I said the other skill that I was going to show you an example of was entering group conversations. And this one I like because I think it's an example of how it's not always clear how to break down these skills in useful ways. So I would like you to, in the chat, think about either if you were a kid and someone was giving you advice, or if you were giving your child advice, what is common advice if there's a group of people over here having a conversation, you want to encourage your kid to join them? What might you tell them to do? Totally depends on the age. That's a good point. So feel free to answer for any age. A question to go in with. That's really good. Find out one kid's name today. Listen to what's being talked about. Ask, can I play or can I join? Yeah, often when I present this question, one of the first thing that pops into people's heads is just like, go up and talk to them. Teach them about taking turns, my turn, your turn. Yeah, very good. So these are all great social skills to think about across settings. Um, but if you're in this situation where there's a group of kids, they're already talking about something, and your kids wanting to join the conversation, some of the advice that parents often give is just like more morale encouragement, like go say hi, go introduce yourself, go join in. In practicality, some of those tips, if taken very literally, and if your child struggles to integrate some of the other cues and context, can lead to awkwardness or a lack of success in joining. So, for example, like go introduce yourself. If these kids are over here having a conversation about Roblox and I walk up and I say, I'm Kelly, for them it might be jarring. They might not know why I'm there. They might wonder why I interrupted their conversation about Roblox. Um, if they're talking about Roblox and I walk up and I say, can I play? And they're not playing something, then they might be confused about what I want from them. Um, so a lot of these well-intentioned, encouraging statements sometimes are not the most useful in terms of like what are the exact steps that I should be following and all the things I should be considering to successfully enter this interaction. So I'm going to show you what Pierce um, um, uses to break this down. And I flipped our first two strategies here because I think for this one, there's a lot of steps that it breaks the skill down into, and then we spend a lot of time teaching each step. So this is what the sequential steps look like for peers. First, listening to the conversation. Someone said that in the chat. Good on you. Before you even walk up and say anything, you want to be paying attention to what the conversation is about. You want to not get too close too fast, but you also want to not be staring at these people from a distance. So we talk about what is an appropriate distance to stand and how can you like casually observe or like pick up on what the conversation is about before you jump right in. So number three, use a prop. It's one that gets a good laugh from kids because it's seemingly a little nonsensical, but um, if you are a person to whom social interactions tend to come more naturally, you might think about the last time you approached a group conversation. You're not standing looking directly at a group trying to determine what they're talking about. We often look at our phones or maybe look at a book or kind of casually walk by. So we're not coming on too strong. That's an unwritten rule. So giving kids a concrete way to approach casually like that can be really helpful. Identifying a topic, finding a common interest, moving closer, waiting for the right pause. So not jumping in right when someone's in the middle of a sentence. And at number eight, we get into actually joining the conversation. So if you're coaching your kid through this, you might not have thought of all these things that a lot of people pick up on naturally, but a kid with a developmental disability or social communication challenges might not be thinking about all these steps, and making it more concrete might be really helpful for them. So then when they get to the point where they're actually joining the conversation, what are the different ways they can join? Making a comment, ask a question, give a compliment. Assessing if you're accepted into the group conversation. We'd like to hope that every group that our kid goes up and wants to talk to is happy to have them, but sometimes kids and adults are not very welcoming. How do you know if that's what's happening? How do you um, leave in a way that you're protecting yourself and that you're not, making the situation more uncomfortable for yourself? Um, I like that number 10 is introducing yourself because that's often something we say, like, oh, go and introduce yourself. But like I said, if that's the first step you start with, sometimes that might be jarring or not received well. So, when is it appropriate to introduce yourself? So, I really like that example from the peers materials. Videos for joining in and employing all those steps to join a conversation that I'll link to if you're interested. Um, Repetition and practice looks like a lot of the same. In an official peers group, what we would do is put kids in groups and say, all right, so and so, you're going to try entering this group. So um, get kids talking about a topic and have a kid practice moving closer, listening to the topic, thinking of a way to join the conversation, a comment or a question. Um, Doing that over and over helps them really feel comfortable with the different steps and problem solve when maybe confusing things come up. I have a story from my teen group that I really like that is from this joining a group conversation lesson. Because teens, I find teens are the hardest to, make them think that I'm cool and have anything worth saying. And that was the case with this group. And we were doing the role plays for joining a group conversation. And before I had even set up the activity, some of my group members were already talking about something. I think they were talking about like anime movies or something. And I approached them as the group leader in an attempt to get them to focus on the activity and say, like, okay, here's what we're going to do. And they were very disinterested in what I had to say. And were a little mean to me about, like, can you just leave us alone? Um, but they were socializing successfully. And in that situation, I was the one that was not accepted into that group conversation. So what I did was step back for a little bit, let them have their conversation about anime. And then when I felt like when there was an appropriate pause, and once I had appropriately oriented to what they were talking about, kind of rejoin the conversation. I asked them to reflect on what had happened when I tried to join their conversation. And they were able to identify a lot of the things that we talked about, like, well, you weren't paying attention to what we were talking about. You were interrupting. We did not accept you into the conversation. And we were also able to, apply that to, well, then should I give up? Should I never try to talk to you again? They were like, no, you can try again. You can do better this time. So it's not always going to look like the learning opportunity maybe you as a parent or a teacher set it up to be, but there's once you're having these conversations and once you have this structure of like different skills and steps to look for, you can find a lot of creative ways to help apply those. And they did accept me into their conversation on my second try. So, um, for joining a group conversation at this point in the peers progression, you've kind of like built on some of these initial skills, and you're really trying to think about now, how do I apply these skills in ways in environments where it's meaningful to my child? So some other lessons that we do in peers is helping teens identify like what some of their interests are and where are places in the community or in their lives where they're likely to meet people with common interests. So we help them kind of identify events at libraries, for example, like game nights or book clubs or like craft clubs. And depending on each of their interests and things they're excited about, finding ways that they might connect with other people who share those. And then encouraging them to, now they've practiced these skills in our group, they've practiced with their parents and their families. Now, how can they be challenged to go out in a place that might be a little scarier, a little more nerve-wracking, but make connections with unfamiliar people and apply those skills. And again, that's a great time for debriefing, talking about what worked and what didn't, but really trying to like gradually work towards these more like socially meaningful practice opportunities. All right, so I'm very excited. We've got some time left. Um, I would love to now, if possible, I don't know if it's easier to do so in the chat or if people want to come off mute, only if you're comfortable. But I'd love to talk about how some of these strategies might apply to the skills that you mentioned are challenging for your child or your teen. Um, so I can go back in the chat to some of the skills that you mentioned, but is anyone interested in maybe offering one as an example that we could work through together? How do I help my child who's been rejected a lot when trying to enter groups? All right. Needy, I hope I'm saying that right. Do you mind? She has lost all friends. Um, can you tell me what environments your child is struggling with? Um, okay, so I'm going to get distracted by the chat. So I'm going to try to focus on Needy for 1 second. So school. School's a hard one. For a parent because you're not there to directly observe. Do you have an idea? Oh, that's totally fine. Um, do you have an idea of, how people have reacted poorly? What things maybe what miscommunications might have happened? Um, what do you know about the way that your daughter tries to approach social groups and what happens? Hmm. Yeah, so I'd have some questions and some observations that I would probably try to work through. Yeah. One possibility of what's happening is that, well, there's many possibilities. So one, some questions to be asked would be about how your child is approaching. So like how is she phrasing questions? When is she trying to enter the conversation? Are they already have they started an activity that maybe she's not picking up on the fact that they're in the middle of it? It's not a good time to join. Um, are there things that she might not be picking up on or like know how to regulate, like how close she's standing to them or tone of voice? The other thing is some kids like I said at the beginning, friendship's a choice, and it's tough a lot for our kids that we feel like they're isolated or excluded more often than others. Um, but kind of helping her frame like maybe these people are just not the right friends to seek interactions with. Are there other people that she's more likely to share social or common interests with? So all of those are definitely things to explore. Really, socially have been huge. Yeah. Um, so in terms of like, I'm going to bring up the different peers topics. Now, peers is not the end all be all, but I do think that they cover a lot of some of the core social skills that tend to cause kids challenges. Um, so based on your observations of your kid, both with you and with other kids, you might think like, does she have some of these more foundational skills? How does she do with trading information? How does she do with some of those steps we talked about for entering conversations, like listening to what the conversation is about, waiting for a pause, standing an appropriate distance away, like some of those very specific skills might be contributing to the larger, like not being able to interact with a group of kids. Um, so those are things to maybe explore with your kid and look for if you have the chance to observe interactions or if she has the ability to talk to you about what's going on. Um, Looking for the different steps of the process and thinking about what smaller building block skills might be contributing to this difficulty. Teresa, can I ask, you said I work on eye contact on a daily basis with my students during communication. Are you able to tell me a little more about that? Like, do you discuss why eye contact is important, how you practice it? I will say, so I mentioned that eye contact specifically, at least some autistic people. I don't know if this is a similar experience for the kids y'all work with, but sometimes eye contact can feel uncomfortable. And like I said, it's also an integral part of many social interactions. So um, with my clients and with our groups, we like to talk about if a social skill, as others typically expect it, is hard for you, what are some alternate strategies? So self-advocacy, explaining to friends that you don't like eye contact, and here's other ways that you can know that I'm paying attention. Or replacement, like for example, if I don't like eye contact, we had one person in a group say, like, well, here's my strategy. I just look at this part of someone's forehead, then they still know that I'm paying attention to them, but I'm not uncomfortable. So that's an example of some of the conversations I've tended to have around eye contact. When someone says hello to a student in the hall, hmm. Yeah, Teresa, you bring up a good point about social interaction when students are non-speaking or using alternate communication devices. So some of these skills can look really different if kids are not interacting verbally. So you stop and show them to look at the person. Um, I bet you do some modeling. I bet you do some practicing. So stopping them in the hall at the opportunity to practice. So that's all application of some of the strategies that we talked about. Um, I wonder if your kids, with kids who maybe are non-speaking or have intellectual disability, yeah, modeling every day. Sometimes the didactic piece, so the like talking about why something is important, this piece, that might be less helpful because you might not be able to assess their understanding of it as well. They might not be able to apply that kind of discussion. So the repetition and the practice becomes even more important. Um, Lots of modeling. If there's anyone else in here that works with AAC devices, I love, Teresa, that you're talking about modeling because I think that's something we forget a lot when kids are non-speaking, that kids who learn language, verbal language in the typical way, learn from so much observation and watching other people interact verbally and other people interacting with them verbally, even if they're not like it's not reciprocal. And so when kids have AAC devices, remembering to model using their AAC device too. So when you're talking to a student who's non-speaking, maybe you use their device to echo some of the things you're saying verbally, to echo how that can be used interpersonally. Having the support of other teachers and paraprofessionals helps tremendously throughout the day when modeling. Yes, enlisting other people in whatever environment you're in to know what skill a kid is working on and to help support in creating opportunities to practice and then encouraging them because a big piece for a kid who has social challenges and who maybe has not been responded to positively when they have tried to interact socially is those corrective experiences. So trying a skill and having it be supported and encouraged and responded to well. So anyone in your environment, friends, family, siblings, teachers, other staff to encourage the practicing of the social skills is huge for confidence. Um, Anyone else have a thought or a question? All right. Oh, my daughter has social issues when she's doing an odd behavior. Peers are reacting that. Um, Catherine, that's a great one. So I'm curious, how do I get her to realize that's not what's happening? Um, so I would be curious, um, what I don't know if you're there in these situations, what other kids are doing. Because obviously her interpretation of that behavior is what's troubling her. But so I guess talking about how to differentiate um, other reactions and what those might mean versus what bullying is. So that would be a good time for those perspective taking questions like what, you know, they're doing this, you feel this way, but what's another explanation for how they might be reacting? What might they be thinking or experiencing? Um, as concrete as you can make it about tell me more about what's happening and what might it look like if they were really bullying? How could it look different than that? Um, Piers has a part of a lesson that's about like differences between laughing with someone and laughing at someone, and how do you tell if someone's laughing with you or at you? And that includes looking at things like, are they saying positive words while they're laughing? Are they looking at you or are they looking at someone else while they're laughing? Like all these like little nuanced cues that give you information about, if you say something and I laugh and look at someone else, then maybe we're laughing at you versus if I'm sharing enjoyment. Yeah. Playing 50 questions. That sounds about right. Yeah, I think a great time for perspective taking, like conversations. That's a hard one to think about. Like, how can you role play? Because it's not it's not an easy thing to recreate how other people are reacting to her. One thing that she could practice or like work on is how she responds. Like, does she ask them about their reaction? Does she advocate for herself to explain why she might be doing a certain behavior? And, kind of that self-advocacy, like this is me stimming. I do it to help myself focus. Like, does that help her connect with other peers and feel less targeted for those behaviors? Um, Nancy said, how to get them to accept social contracts, respect for authority. Um, yeah, that's a tough one. So, Nancy, my first question would be, can you think of the different behaviors that show you that someone understands or respects authority? And in what specific situations, like what would they do that you would know they respected authority? As Nancy types, hopefully I'll just connect that back to, oh yeah, most kids go to school and do assignments. Yeah, so I think just as an example, some kids might hear you have to respect authority and understand what that means in terms of in the moment how I respond to a teacher or how I behave when work is presented to me. But kids who have social challenges, who have trouble with interpreting abstract language, respect for authority might be pretty meaningless to them. So, helping get very specific about what that looks like. So, your example was kids might just know that if they're being respectful and responsible, they go to school and they do their assignments. Sounds like your kid doesn't understand why that is why that's important. And that's normal. So, one way you can do it is to try to explain the rationale for an assignment. That can be tough because kids who have very short-term attention and trouble with that future thinking, thinking about long-term consequences, they're not going to really connect with it's important to do my assignments so that I, you know, do well academically, go to college, get a job. They don't care about that in the moment. So how can you make it meaningful to them in the moment? Um, that's where some like very clear, concrete expectations and consistent rewards and consequences. And by consequences, I don't mean punishment, not like, oh, you're not, doing what you're supposed to. Here's punishment, but can you connect it to something more concrete for them? So when you finish this assignment, then you can play your video game, or when you finish this assignment, then you're done. You can go to recess. How can you connect those in concrete ways to help them understand like what the expectation is? It takes a lot. This is a common challenge for parents when your kid doesn't seem to understand the bigger picture or the long-term consequence of the things you're asking them to do. Because of course we want our kids to not just do it because we say so. We want them to understand why things like school are important. Um, but sometimes those things take a long time to set in. And so the short term, using a lot of structure, using a lot of clear first this, then that can be really helpful. And then the big picture comes with a lot of repetition and practice. First, then boards, yes. And I think the way that those are implemented, sometimes teachers or parents worry that it feels like a punishment, but so presenting it not as like a you have to do this or you're doing something bad, but like just helping them. Like kids struggle with things like planning out tasks and sequencing in their head and knowing when one thing starts and one thing's finished. So providing it in a way that's just this is structure rather than, you know, yeah, transitions too. Yeah, great feedback. Well, it's been really fun talking to you all. Um, I will real quick just put up a slide that has my email on it. And I'm happy to share these slides after, so I'll try to put in like links and stuff like that. But there's my email. I also link to the peers page where you can find some of those videos and stuff like that. Um, but I'm also happy if you shoot me an email to try to direct you to anything that might be more specifically relevant to what you're looking for, if I can. Oh, I didn't share it. Sorry about that. Here it is. All right, there's my email, and there's a link to the beers page. So email me there if you want to chat. I'm happy to.
Kelly, thank you so much for coming on this call with us
Yeah,
tonight.
I
It's a
appreciate you
lot
all
of
engaging in the chat. I
Yeah,
appreciate your ideas.
it was a lot of really valuable information. So it was awesome to have you. And thank you, everybody that came on tonight. Hopefully, you've got a lot of great things to take out of this and work with on your DCC year. And you can, like Kelly said, you can email her if you have any other questions or anything. You can also get a hold of the NODCC as well, and we'll be happy to help you connect with Kelly or find the Purist program, any of that